Alright, let's talk drones. You guys may have heard that this was my project topic, but when I say the word drone, a lot of you think of this. This is a Air Force General Atomics MQ-1 Predator. It is heavily armed. They fight in our wars in the Middle East, and this is what most people think. They think of a war machine, they think of autonomous killing, the ethical questions, right? And it's perpetrated by the media. You know, you see these topics. It's not talking about drones in the US, which is what I explored. It's talking about justification for drone strikes, 55 people killed. The same is true in television, right? We see this as a general theme where the term drone has become highly correlated with these military machines. That's not really the case. This is a chart showing all these different types of drones. This is different countries, not just the US. But what I like to talk about with this image is there's a huge range here, right? I mean, you've got these giant military drones. The Global Hawk is a intelligence gathering aircraft that the US uses. Then you've got these things down here. The AR Patriot is the consumer drone you may have seen. They're like the $300 ones. You can buy them at the hobby store in downtown Los Altos, right? It's something that the public can use. It's got a camera on it. You can fly with your iPhone. So there's this vast range of drones, and most people don't really know about that. That gets me to what I talked about in my paper. The applications and the implications of drone usage in the US. Right? We often think about them fighting in our wars, we think about them overseas as weapons, but the reality is that we can use them in a lot of different industries, there's a lot of different uses. Let's talk about applications. There's two really, you talk about it in the private sector and the government sector. The government sector doesn't necessarily have to be wars, it doesn't have to be fighting, it doesn't have to be launching missiles. We also use it in law enforcement and surveillance, and that's kind of a growing area. And then we have things in the private sector like shipping and agriculture. So let's talk about applications. Agriculture is kind of one of the ones a lot of people don't think about. This, for example, the Yamaha Armax, you can rent it now. It sprays pesticides on crops. The picture on the right is aerial photography. So drones are often used a lot for this kind of purpose. They're increasing in use. You can get great aerial images which provide data for big agriculture. So when you think about consolidated farms and these giant plots, hundreds of thousands of acres, they need a lot of information. And for them to just hit enter on their computer and get something like this to fly and take pictures for them, gather information, they can also use things like infrared cameras. There's a lot of different things that they can use. This sprays pesticides, and because it's not on the ground like a lot of the big moving vehicles that you see on farms, it doesn't cause damage, it's safe, there's no human pilot that can do it autonomously. And there's a lot of benefits to agriculture, which is just one of the areas. Shipping, you guys may have heard of Amazon Prime Air. They had a big press release, it was in the media. I think in a lot of ways it was a great coverage for drones because it offered a very available and easy to recognize way of using drones in the US. Their goal is to get it to customers' hands in 30 minutes or less. This is a quadcopter, which means it's got 8 rotors, kind of like a little helicopter but with a lot more blades. I don't think that this technology is particularly close. There's a lot of legal roadblocks to get proper legislation. They're not just going to be zipping through skyscrapers in San Francisco and delivering packages to top-story penthouses. So there's a little bit to go there, but I think it presents a good picture of how we can use these kind of aircraft in the US. This is a funny picture of we attempted a drone delivery, however, all the different options, and that's the result. So this was just somebody making fun, but drone reached sentence and defected to join the machines in the upcoming revolution against mankind. So the worker who arranged this delivery will be punished. This obviously isn't true. They wouldn't do this, but it's a funny example of kind of the fears with drone use. Law enforcement's another big one. So this image is of a nose cone on one of the aircraft. So if you look at my model, you can see how on the nose there's kind of room to put something. You can put this little bulb, and this has all sorts of cameras. This is an infrared picture. And here is a sheriff office using drones. Now, as they stand right now, you need to get proper permission from the FAA, the Federal Aviation Agency. So you need to get each isolated incident. For example, you have a hostage situation and you want something in the air that can take pictures or provide you with a live feed for video. You need to formally request permission. They need to say it's okay. It's a little difficult now, but it does present a nice opportunity. For example, if you want to get pictures inside a building, right? Like, let's say there's a dangerous situation, you don't want to send people in because they might get injured. You can send in a small drone like this, which can fly in the window and take pictures. And if it gets harmed, you lose your $1,000 worth of hardware, but not a human life, which is obviously the more valuable of the two. So this is a growing area. It's also the one which people have the greatest concerns with, because people think of this Orwellian 1984 Big Brother thing where the government's always watching, and I don't think Snowden's NSA releases helped that notion. The government is kind of on our side, but if handled properly, they present a very plausible and beneficial addition to the way we handle law enforcement. Now I talk about implications. This is very wordy. This is how I phrase it in my paper, but we can really visualize it this way. You want to ensure that they don't crash, right? These are the three main problems with drones, obviously kind of shortened down, but pilots have a big concern with mid-air collisions. If you think about manned aircraft see each other coming. Let's say they're headed towards each other, and they can talk with the radio. They can make decisions on the fly. It's easy for them to do that. Autonomous aircraft, like a lot of these drones are, which just run software, they run a program, they've got their route. They can't change, they don't have that kind of human input to quickly change course, to quickly change direction, and so they present a hazard for manned pilots if they can't adjust. The privacy, as I mentioned, is kind of like the scary part of police drones. A lot of people are worried that our privacy won't be maintained, so one of the sources I relied upon a lot in my paper was a government publication. It was a report prepared for Congress about how this impacts our Fourth Amendment rights. So typically we think of the right to privacy as kind of an implied part of the First Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is unreasonable search and seizure. And so if we have the government flying drones, flying quadcopters and aircraft, and they're constantly videotaping us, and they catch you doing something wrong, is it an invasion because they didn't have a reasonable search and seizure and they're still looking in your backyard or over the fence with aircraft? And so that's a big concern. Lots of local governments have kind of banned drones. Now technically that doesn't have any legal weight because the federal government's the only one who can regulate the airspace, but it's it kind of demonstrates this public sentiment against integrating drones. The picture on the far right is the cover page for the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012. It was a bill passed in 2012 which decreed, very importantly, that the legislation for drones must be completed and a kind of a plan made by 2016. So one of the things I talked about in my paper is we talk about drones a lot in the US and we use them abroad, but there aren't any laws for them now. You can't really use them at all, but it doesn't explicitly say that in any law, and there's no plan for integrating them. So that's what this act is intended to provide once it reaches 2016. Unfortunately, about a week ago, they announced it might not be ready until 2022, so we'll have to see. The only reason my drone is technically allowed is under the hobbyist license. So part of the airspace governance laws allow small personal aircraft like RC planes that we all flew as kids. You're allowed to use those, and it's like you have to be under 400 feet of altitude. There's a couple of other restrictions. You can't use them to make any money. But the hobbyist license is kind of what provides the drone laws now, and that's kind of the coming thing. So is that the concern is that the act coming in 2016 won't protect our privacy, won't protect our legal rights, it'll give too much power to the government, and so forth. So now let's talk about the hands-on, because that's kind of drones. I know it's a little complicated, but it's a very interesting subject. But the hands-on project. So there's something called the DIY drone revolution. It's actually pretty much entirely in the Bay Area because this is the center of technology and this is where people like to do this kind of thing for fun on the weekends and have the resources and the knowledge to do it. It took off when you have cheap and inexpensive parts. So we think about like the computer revolution, the personal computer revolution took off because parts were easy to get, they were accessible, and the same is true here. So my objective was to create an autonomous remote control airplane, one which I could put up in the air, hit a command, and it would fly itself on a predetermined route. here's kind of what I have over there in the corner. There's the fixed wing platform, so I selected to use a motor glider, which has a big wingspan, you get a lot of lift, and the propeller's in the back so that when it inevitably crashed, it wouldn't take as much damage. This is the autopilot, so this board, which I will show in person, has a lot of the sensors. And the way this kind of works is, in a normal remote control aircraft, you have a receiver and I have a joystick or a transmitter. The receiver takes those inputs and controls servos, which are little motors, that control the tail and the ailerons and the elevators and things like that, which allow it to fly, right? Those are the control surfaces. This is basically, you plug in, it goes between that receiver and the servos that were already there. And if you just let it sit there, it's just, it's an electrical conduit, it just allows the current to pass through and it's a normal plane. But embedded in this board, which you'll see is about this big, are a bunch of sensors. It's got a gyrometer, or a gyroscope, excuse me, a GPS module, a couple of other things, which allow it to take measurements. And it uses those measurements with some software, which I'll show in the next slide, to fly the aircraft on its own. So it's kind of a shrunken down version of what the military uses, what this whole technology is all about. The telemetry is radios which allow my computer to communicate with it while it's flying. And that allows me to do some adjustments on the fly should that be necessary. Let's talk about software and firmware, but I'll kind of go over this so we can look at it. But it's running something called Mission Planner. Mission Planner runs on PC software. This is all open source because the DIY revolution, the Silicon Valley is all about let's let everyone have access to it. So they had a couple of PhDs in computer science write it, and then everyone else can use it, which is great. This is what it looks like. So I know it looks a little complicated, but it basically allows it allows the user to control their drone, to set a route. This is kind of a map overhead. I think this is the Bay Area. But it's kind of zoomed in, not exactly where we are. This kind of gives you that telemetry. The radios I demonstrated will send live data. Here, it'll send you altitude and ground speed and all these different things. You can set your flight plan. You can configure your aircraft to make sure that the tuning is all right. So it's all very exciting and interesting technology. So here's the practice. This is an old RC plane I had lying around that my dad and I used to fly. There's me with it, there's it flying, and there's me crash landing it. And I wanted to get some practice because I didn't want to spoil the real thing, so it's not too roughed up. And that's the final product. So that's kind of what it looks like. And I'll show everyone what's in it in a minute. But I wanted to conclude, people think drones are 1984, they think they're Terminator. I don't really think that that's the case. After doing all this research, my hands-on project, I think it's an extremely exciting platform. There's a lot of things you can do with it. It's got a lot of uses. And if we integrate it properly, there are a ton of intrinsic benefits to having autonomous aircraft which can do things without human input. In other words, they're MacGyver and R2-D2. So I think that this is kind of how drones should be viewed. Drones are coming, and that's not a bad thing. So thank you, and I'll show you the hands-on project. All right, it's probably easier if everyone gathers around so I can show some of these components in person. So this is the motor glider which I demonstrated on my last slide. I haven't done many modifications to it apart from putting the stroke on the top so that this slides in like that, and I can get coverage from the air. Unfortunately, it's a little too heavy for the motor provided, so the first time I used this, it just nosedived on takeoff and scruffed up the nose. But hopefully at some point I can switch out the motor for something a little more powerful, and that'll allow me to take video. And inside, here, if you guys want to gather around this building, there's a couple of components. So, let's see if I can untangle all of these wires. So I explained that the way this works is, here's my receiver. right here. So when I use the joystick, this takes in the commands real time. All RC airplanes have something like this. This is a little more high tech because it requires a lot of inputs. This is what's called a speed controller. So this is where all the servos are plugged in. It controls the throttle on the engine right here in the back. And yes, those rubber bands are supposed to be on it. They fold out this way. Here's kind of these little plugs are for each of the control surfaces. You see this line here. You know, this moves back and forth, and this moves up and down. I don't have ailerons hooked up to it yet, but you know, you can fly it in a pretty manageable way that way. And this is the APM board, which I can pass around. This goes to the radio, this telemetry. And then each of these little plugs goes in one side and they come out the other to this. So kind of imagine this as just between these plugs and this. And that allows me to do things. So this runs its own kind of software, which is also open source. It's kind of easy to use. It certainly doesn't require a computer science degree, but it's also not the most intuitive. And I've had some troubles because I'm running Windows in my Mac and it's complicated, but it should be getting going quickly. And here's the battery, so you're welcome to peek inside and pass this around if you'd like, and look at it. It's not too fragile, so.
Did you rebalance the CG?
I did rebalance. Well, I did rebalance the CG a little bit. It just had to do with where the battery was. So.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyway, so you're welcome to look at it.